you don't mind a little bit of commuting.
I was like, yeah, this is most people just kind of said it without
what would matter to this crowd.
The thing I was really most excited for in the beginning.
Hi. Welcome everybody to the Genetic Engineering Society Colloquium. Here's some cheese. I brought it from my house. It was refrigerated. It's safe. This is stinky cheese. So if you are a stinky cheese kind of person,
don't pass that around, Jason. Leave until the end of it.
I'm going out of town, so I'm not going to keep the cheese in my house. So if anybody would like some cheese, I put this cutting board and this knife in my little bike bag today, just for you guys. So you can pass that around. It's Havarti dill, it's a quarter cheddar, and it's stinky cheese. So, all right. So thanks for coming today.
Which one's what, real fast?
The one with the marbly look is porter cheddar, and the others are Havarti dill.
Awesome. And that's stinky.
And that's the stinky cheese. Yeah. Mike's gonna give it a try.
Don't even smell.
I do not lie. All of you should at least smell the stinky cheese.
Everyone who don't eat it smells.
Like now we can't.
Okay. Oh, I can smell it from here.
Smell dirty socks.
Excellent.
Yeah, no.
Hopefully that doesn't drive anyone away. So before we introduce our speaker today, upcoming events related to GES. Any? Jen, was that just a shudder?
Somebody walked over my grave.
Oh gosh. Okay. Not sure how to deal with that.
Just some IGERT reminders. Your surveys are out. Please complete them. Thank you if you already have. Also, don't forget to send me your CVs and any other awesome things you are doing.
Great, thank you. Next week, we have a faculty member from New York's New School. He works at the intersection of thinking about design and public engagement. And I met him a couple months ago and invited him to come down and give a talk. I think some of you are going out to lunch with him as well. His name is Elliot Montgomery. Yes.
And please let me know if you want to meet with him or have lunch with him, because we still have a lot of room in his itinerary.
Great. And I will not be here next week, but others. Todd is going to introduce Elliot, and other people are meeting with him. So enjoy that visit. Any other announcements? All right. So today we get to hear from one of our IGERT fellows, Katie Barnhill-Dilling, who is a student that I've been working with since the fall of 2014. Katie's work has surrounded issues of genetic engineering in trees, and with a particular focus on the genetically modified American chestnut project, which is a grant that Katie and Jessica Barnes and myself and Louis Rivers and Andy Binder submitted a couple of years ago. We revised it a couple times before it got funded, as is the way with national science funding. And one of the things that Katie brought to our group, which was really expanded our project, was to think in particular about the ways that this emerging technology, the GM American chestnut tree, overlaps with issues of indigenous concerns and indigenous sovereignty and governance. So as she will tell you in her talk, I'm sure I'm not spoiling too much, but the historic range of the American chestnut, as well as where the field trials have been done and where that tree might be restored, overlaps with indigenous lands, Native American lands, tribal lands in this country. And so our project, largely because of Katie's influence and ideas and creativity and previous connections, has enabled us to make that concern a part of our research project. So I'm really happy to introduce Katie to you all. Many of you know her already, and we can be really excited for her too, because she's planning to defend her dissertation this spring, which is very exciting. So without further ado, Katie.
Thank you. So thank you, Jason. Like you said, hopefully all things being equal, this is the last time I introduce myself as a PhD student. So we're about 5 weeks out from my defense, so the fact that I'm standing here fully functional is kind of a testament to my own ability to multitask or not, or stay completely disconnected from reality. It depends on how you think about it. So in today's presentation, I'm kind of doing a mix of results, but also looking into the black box of research a bit, because this has been a really interesting experience, and there has been an ongoing moment of surprise about every couple of months, and I wanted to share that with you all a little bit because of the nature of this group. Also, to orient us, I am going to be multitasking up here as well. Something that may not be done very much in a lot of academic circles that you all work in is a lot of institutions are now beginning with a territory acknowledgement. And so what that says here, where we are in Wake County, is that we are now gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Tuscarora Nation. So this is happening to sort of acknowledge and give a little bit of concession to some of the history and the land where we are. It's happening a lot more regularly at universities in Canada for different reasons, but it's just an interesting way to sort of situate this where we are and remind us where exactly how we connect with some of this larger story, because the Tuscarora, by largely coincidence, comes up quite a bit later. The other thing that often happens at gatherings, at least among the Haudenosaunee, who I'll introduce more clearly in a minute, is the Thanksgiving address. This is the words that come before all else. It sort of brings everyone together. It sets the tone for the meetings. It sets the tones for the gatherings. I don't really know exactly if it's co-opting to read it, so I'm not going to. It's not usually done in English, but I wanted to share with you this is just another way to gather meetings. This actually goes on for a couple of dozens of verses. So each verse in turn can pay attention to different relatives. And by relatives, it's different plants, animals, the sun, different celestial bodies. So it's a really interesting way to sort of orient ourselves to the worldview that we're going to be spending a little bit of time looking at. It's also definitely a place to think about our shared humanity, because there's always side conversations about like, don't let so-and-so get a hold of the blessing, we'll be here for 3 days and never eat. So I think we all can kind of relate to that sort of idea of like that uncle at Thanksgiving or something that gets a hold of the blessing and you're there for 3 days. And so it's really funny to hear that happen across time and cultures. These are separate, I apologize, it's really annoying. So as I mentioned, I wanted to sort of unpack this black box a little bit. So as a group, we talk a lot about interdisciplinarity, especially in this sort of blend of natural and social sciences. But often when we get to the socio-cultural considerations, we stop and say, wow, it's complicated, and talk a little bit about it without actually kind of delving into that complexity. And I think there's value here in sort of explaining some of that complexity, especially for my dissertation. For that in particular, this is a quote from one of my chapters. The data is both the story that got me to the point where I could even collect data at all, and the stories from the communities themselves. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. So to reorient a lot of us who already know this story, and for those who are new to it, starting with the American chestnut, which is where obviously we're working. The chestnut once dominated eastern forests. It was important ecologically and economically to the people living in the historic range, which is namely the Appalachian Ridge, like Jason said. The early 20th century, this nasty fungal pathogen came in, 4 billion trees disappeared, Appalachian ways of life are forever altered. There's a lot going on with this in other spaces, so I'll sort of stop the story there for that, but these are the cankers that destroyed the chestnut. As soon as the blight was discovered, a lot of different efforts have been working towards restoring it, conferring blight resistance. We in our research team focused primarily on the transgenic version. And this is one of the lab techs. This is a commonly used picture. This is some of their little babies there. We focus on the transgenic version for a variety of reasons, but a couple of the interesting pieces that are relevant to me today and to us today is the sort of ecology of the American chestnut. It's going to be designed to be released. That's a newer idea. A lot of our GM stuff is designed to be contained, as all of you know. And as also, as a lot of you know, the regulatory system is set up around this idea of containment. So dealing with sort of the regulatory system and the governance ideas around it for a design to spread species are going to look a little different. And not to forget that there is some resistance to this. This is not to sort of explode this idea that GM trees are the devil. This is just to remind us that it's not Haudenosaunee versus the world. There are other institutions and other groups that are a little skeptical of this idea. So this is our context, and this is the study site. So if you can see where we are in New York State, I look at and work with the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So that includes the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora. The Tuscarora returned back north after the Tuscarora Wars, it's hard to say, in the early 18th century here in North Carolina. And so these are the 6 nations. A couple of key points about the 6 nations and how it's a little bit different from perhaps other institutions. A lot of American Indian strong tribal forces consolidated as a result of colonialism, including the Eastern Band of Cherokee, as a way to sort of present united face. That wasn't the case here. This was already a strong confederacy. And to that end, they have been largely able to maintain traditional governance structure. So a lot of the groups in the United States have been completely reorganized and completely redone. And that's really impacted how they relate to each other in the country. But this is one group, one of the only groups that sort of maintained original structure as best one can in the face of genocide. And like Jason said, the sort of release of the potential GM chestnut and all the different ways it may move forward is happening in these traditional lands and is happening in very close proximity to contemporary territory. So this is the sort of top half of the map that I showed previously of New York State, and that shows the current land holdings of the Haudenosaunee peoples. There's a little bit more land perhaps than is present here because of politics of federal versus state recognition, but this is largely how the situation looks now. And these are several years old now, but these are the numbers of field trials in certain locations. So not only do we have the potential release coming through the end use or the release of the GM chestnut, but there's also field trials already happening within very close proximity. A pretty substantial field trial is happening 3 miles from the Onondaga Nation border, and there's no consultation needed for field trials. So that's another issue that I talk about in one of my papers. But this is sort of the situation. We have this tree that might be released. We have these people living here. What are we going to do about that combination? So I worked previously in central New York on the Onondaga Creek Revitalization Plan, and that was a watershed restoration governance process. It was really inclusive of all of these different values, and this is what I envisioned when I sort of came to the project. Maybe we can sort of replicate it. So this is from the Onondaga Environmental Institute. This is sort of this model they came in with. There were some clean lines. We have this technical information. We have this public education. Goals from the public. We're going to build a nice plan. And this is some of the ways they did that. It was charrette style. It was design style. It was just some really fun, innovative, at the time, this is about 10 years old, ways to engage publics. They had this really nice plan with a lot of different values. I evaluated this as part of my master's work of how inclusive it was of Indigenous values. So again, I thought maybe we could replicate something like this when it came to the chestnut, and I'll paddle off into the sunset happily. Definitely not what happened for a variety of reasons, some of which are still ongoing. But in all of this, I came upon a couple of different types of surprise that I wanted to address, and not that they were brand new to me, but the depth of their presence in this project sort of surprised me at many turns. So I've worked in a pretty wide range of communities, like all over the globe. I'm kind of used to being this person that comes in and needs to earn trust. But I don't think I was really expecting the level of, or the degree to which trust was such a moving target. So we sort of get in, we're able to have certain conversations, and after getting the time and talking to more people, you see that there's so much more that they're not telling you, and so this idea of a moving target really challenged me for a while. With the Creek project I mentioned earlier, these were stakeholders and researchers who'd already worked together for decades. And they had a highly vested interest in the creek, and I think I took some of that for granted when I started the Chestnut project, not realizing how much time had gone into that previous work. But I'd worked in Haudenosaunee communities, I had contacts. They didn't really know me though, they knew someone I knew. On what we thought would be a research trip in October of 2015, we ended up sitting around an office conference table for about 3 hours talking about all kinds of really interesting things with some of our future collaborators. But none of it was ever going to go on the record. None of it was even close to an interview. It was all just sort of sniffing each other out, for lack of a better phrase. And I know it was a part of the trust building phase, and that was really important. And that's been an important dimension of this project, and from so many states away, and I know for some of you who work in other countries, it's also a challenge. From far away, that's a really hard thing to do. We've had a few participants agree to be interviewed off the record in addition to that. Some of that happens when we can sort of follow up with them later, but some of those not at all. So this is a specific example that Jason was there for. We were on the Onondaga Nation. We thought we were going in for an interview. Man, this is the one that got away. We had this like hours-long conversation. It was beautiful. It was everything you want to hear about sort of the experiences he's had growing up and how it influences how he feels about this Chestnut project. And at the end of it all, nope, I don't want it on the record. We didn't want to try to strong arm him or anything. But it was really raw and really pretty emotional. But at the end of the day, it was not for us to have as researchers. It was for us to have as people. And that was a really powerful moment for me as a researcher, coming to understand how I fit in this space. Because there's nothing I would ever want to do to take that time away. It was really powerful. But at the same time, gosh, I wish I could talk about some of it. And to that end, this idea of living history. So this has two parts in how I think about it. To begin, I'll get to this in a little bit. No one in these communities really has any living memory of the chestnut tree. So we come in thinking, oh, we're going to talk about these great things in governance, and they're going to want to bring in traditional knowledge about the chestnut. Well, no one remembers the tree because it was wiped out before anyone alive really would remember it. And simultaneous to that, it happened, the chestnut disappeared at the same time that the Indian boarding school era came in. So like one of our participants, his grandparents were up and taken, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, I suggest looking up that part of our history. But the short story is a lot of tribal children were taken from their homes, sent to boarding school, and the goal is to kill the Indian to save the man. So these things are happening concurrently. So we walk into this space thinking we're going to get some traditional knowledge, we're going to be able to talk about this. There's nothing there. There's generational trauma, and there's a generational gap. And these, some of our participants will talk very plainly about it, and it's really intense to try to think through some of this. The other thing that's interesting is these treaties that we navigate as sort of non-natives with natives that they've signed over the course of the last few hundred years are not artifacts to them. They're sort of living documents. The way that they see title of the people that signed them, there are people today that hold the same title, so it's as if those people are still around. So these are really living documents, these treaties. And when they are constantly broken, it's a very different sense to some of the folks we talk to than just a dusty piece of paper not being acknowledged. And that's really hard for someone coming from a different perspective to understand. But these are really personal living history ideas. So as you may have guessed from the first few minutes of my talk, I go on asking questions about the chestnut, and all of the sort of history and all of the complexity comes out in every conversation I have. There's never once been a conversation that started about the chestnut that did not tug on these really complex stories that I'm talking about. Now, sorry, that was the wrong button. And access. So the idea of getting into a community that you're not a part of, and sort of getting trust and being able to speak with people frankly, is definitely real. It's really hard. I mean, there's no other way to put it. You need a gatekeeper. There's a reason that phrase is used. The running joke, I think, for us has been we have an Indian guide. And we do. One of the gentlemen who's going to be down for the workshop in a few weeks is Neil Patterson. He's been a liaison between tribal communities and the outside world for 30 years now. And none of this would have been possible without him. He made all the introductions, he invites us to meetings, and every time I talk to him, I come away with new ideas that totally screw up my chapters. I think he's done that 3 times now. And that's been part of it. Like, the more I learned about the depth of the worldview assumptions that I thought I had, it's just everything gets upended. He's definitely been the most important contact I've had in all of this, and I can't honor his generosity and his wisdom enough. I hope some of you get the chance to meet him in a few weeks. But if we didn't have a meal, there's no way I'd be getting into some of these spaces. And so the assumptions I think we make about projects that are done with Indigenous communities, unless we know about some of the backstory, the gatekeeping, and the access, we may be getting really strange conclusions from projects, because you may be getting a very small subset of people that may or may not represent the broader group. And I think it's important to think through how this information is generated, not just the information itself. So as all of this unfolds, so all of these complications, I guess, arise. There's been a lot of surprise that challenged my research, but I got it. I had to be very versatile about data gathering, as you might imagine. A few hastily planned, very last-minute trips to Syracuse. We learned some rough institutional review board lessons about that, and I'm doing all of this with a tiny infant at home, mind you, so that was more evidence that we need more women in these spaces to help sort of figure out how to do this all together. But I got to these meetings, I conduct formal interviews, I amass my data. It's coming together. So I get all of this data, and I have to sit down with it, transcribe it, code it, and then what happens then when you start to really listen to your data? When you get a little lost in it. So for me, for a while, I stopped treating these interviews as purely data. On one level, you want to stay focused on your research, but on the other, these are people whose communities have been through some serious change, and the last thing you want to do is contribute to the sort of negative experiences they've had. And the data and the interviews and all of these notes and all of just the stuff I had in mass, it's really impactful. I'm not sure if many of you out there have sat down with people whose families have been ripped apart by genocide, but going back through some of my notes and interview recordings took a toll. I think it's natural to hit a space when you just need to stew on heavy ideas in any research. But as a European American researcher, I really had to grapple with my own place in all of this, my own place in colonialism and how this genocide fits in, and some of these big systemic injustices. But also as someone who's worked in the environmental field my whole life, I feel like this whole late-stage capitalism scene makes no sense anyway, and some of the things they were saying started to make really good sense. And so the existential crisis unfolds for a while. And I knew it. I was spinning, I was rabbit holing, and I was very aware of it. And while it stalled me for a while, it's sort of human to be impacted by some of these stories. And I think it helped me more meaningfully understand what I had when I was able to come back out and start to write about it. And sort of honor these experiences and communicate them with greater care. So after that existential crisis started to pass, barely, because some of y'all have seen the job market, I started to look at the data for these chapters with fresh eyes. So my interviews touch on some really emotional ideas about how humans want to live on the earth and how we treat each other. And putting these ideas into academic scholarship, tidily into some framework that builds on and contributes to the literature, it felt a bit too much like some epistemic violence at the time. And scholars write about this, about decolonizing methodologies and the violence of research in some spaces. And this is where this comes in. Why didn't I just study turtles? Once upon a time, I thought about studying freshwater turtles. There is a gap in the literature in North Carolina because I was looking it up. That would have been a lot easier, right? But after grappling with some of these challenging questions, I did put this in academic, digestible enough, we'll see in a few weeks form, and I do want to share some of the broad strokes of what I came away with. So these are the broad ideas of two of my chapters that I'm going to address, in the absence of the clever titles that I know Jason will help contribute soon enough. This is just the information. So I'll talk a little bit about the results as broadly but as meaningfully as I can here in the time that I have. And I'm going to begin with something known as reciprocal restoration. So I started this project thinking it would be solely focusing on environmental justice and the inclusion of traditionally marginalized people in broader environmental decision making. I still am talking about environmental justice in one of my chapters, but I also learned that a lot of Indigenous communities in North America reject this sort of idea of environmental justice for a lot of different reasons, which I can go into another time. And one of the ways that some of our participants are thinking about the possibility of the chestnut coming into their space is through this idea of reciprocal restoration. So this is the broad question. So could the American chestnut case be an example of reciprocal restoration in Haudenosaunee communities? Reciprocal restoration is a type of biocultural restoration, and that is largely this, the mutually reinforcing restoration of land and culture. So it's very much rooted to Indigenous spaces, Indigenous governance, Indigenous ecologies. But as we move through and really expand our ideas of what restoration means, we're looking at it more from a biocultural perspective. This is not brand new. The idea of biocultural restoration comes out of the late 80s, working on some of these protected area managements in the tropics, so these sort of big ideas. The biodiversity in the world often corresponds with Indigenous people. So the biodiversity hotspots and the Indigenous language hotspots.
Just to understand this concept, is this all assumed to be like a positive feedback loop within the Haudenosaunee community, or is there any reciprocity between the Haudenosaunee community and the outside world?
That's where this goes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it does start to be relationship with the world. So that's a really good point. I think I'll get to it. If not, remind me, because it'll unfold a little bit and start to get hopefully more clear. So starting off from here, this is a poem, I guess, from Mohawk, which is the Mohawk Akwesasne, which is up in the northern part of New York State near Canada. So this is sort of our space we're starting from, right? So, and I'll link that because I know that's kind of a leap in just a moment. So GMOs we have no songs for, we have no ceremonies. That's not what the Creator made as seeds, that was made by man. We don't have songs for them. Again, this is sort of where we're starting from when you go in and ask some of these leaders about what they think of a GM chestnut or a transgenic chestnut. And this is pretty meaningful. They're not really sure what to make of it because it doesn't click, it doesn't have a bin to land in. So that really drives a lot of the analysis of moving forward. So reciprocal restoration is intended to sort of link the sort of restorative process with the ecology, with the broader culture. To your point, I'm not sure if you mean with like outside world as in the environment or with non-native groups. Jury's a little bit still out on that, and hopefully we'll still get to that. But for now, we're looking at sort of the idea of cultural restoration as in these groups and communities that have seen a lot of decline over the years. And so one example is language and culture revitalization. So can the chestnut be a part of this language and cultural revitalization? Up at Six Nations, they are losing a lot of their first language speakers. So the people who speak Iroquois languages first, I think there's only one Tuscarora left on the planet, handful of Onondaga. Some of the other nations have higher numbers for different reasons. And there are considerable efforts to restore language. So how could the chestnut play a role in digging into some of this language revitalization? And one of the ways that's been happening for us is we, in our project team, a consultant at a Syracuse University, which has an Iroquois linguist certificate, is working, he runs that program, he's PhD level, and he is working on sort of investigating the bases of Iroquois languages to help generate new words. So the words that he is thinking of creating around GM and genetic engineering and DNA and some of these ideas that we take for granted, he's going back into the structure of the language to try to build the words to communicate to the elders about these ideas. So in that sense, it's very much working with this idea of language revitalization. So he's going into communities, he's talking to first language speakers, he's really working through some pretty heady stuff, and he will be traveling here in a few weeks as well, so hopefully his presentation will shed some light on that. I mean, it's amazing how much worldview is reflected in just simple words. So there's some of the Iroquois words have like 5 or 6 verbs embedded in one word because they're very relational. So he's trying to communicate this and build these languages, build up new words from old languages to try to communicate. And And to that end, cultural revitalization, those are definitely going hand in hand. There's a lot of cultural revitalization happening in these communities. So there's a lot of sort of bringing in the high school kids and doing like old ways, like wilderness trips. Which one of our colleagues, you can imagine how that goes. These are just teenagers being dragged into the wilderness and like forced to try to eat bear fat. They are not always happy about it, because a lot of them weren't raised traditionally. A lot of them were raised, you know, just sort of as you can imagine. So trying to figure out ways to dovetail Chestnut project stuff with some of these already in progress revitalization efforts is really what I'm looking at. And the evidence so far is that it's possible. There's a lot happening. Maybe the Chestnut could strengthen some of these ideas. Another set of dimensions to the reciprocal restoration idea is the return to customary use and this idea of decolonizing the diet. So if we want to talk about restoring the chestnut, it has to be in the context of something that already matters to them. So customary use is an ongoing challenge. Customary use might mean traditional tribal lifeways. It might mean traditional medicines, hunting grounds, gathering grounds. The challenge here is that, like a lot of what I've talked about so far, is that if you start to talk about chestnut or one particular dimension, you're sort of enmeshed in sort of this historical controversy that goes back to the 1600s. So it's interesting to hear when you're talking about, we think we're talking about something contemporary. Well, they throw up a 1613 treaty and talk about how it's very relevant here and now. So what the chestnut does is allow these conversations to happen in yet another venue. And while the chestnut does not necessarily further their ability to engage in customary use, it certainly helps to have those conversations in structured spaces with the agencies. So this has been happening in the state level and the federal level agencies, and that's at least creating the space to have the conversation. And decolonizing diet, perhaps obviously, it's trying to go back to some of the older foods. So a lot of these communities, especially those that have been removed, really are stuck on sort of government handouts, government cheese, sugar, salt, and fat, and there's a lot of movement to go back to old foods, to traditional foods as best they can. And chestnuts is one of them. It was pretty big food across the whole eastern United States for a lot of different peoples, including Haudenosaunee communities. So thinking about it as a way to revitalize old foods is another way to sort of dovetail ongoing process that really might make this more compelling to some of these communities. So traditional ecological knowledge, for those of you who are familiar with it, is another really important part of reciprocal restoration. The take-home, I guess, the short version of this is traditional ecological knowledge is sort of the passed-on knowledge of an environment after living somewhere for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. It's a little bit distinct from scientific knowledge in that it's usually the resource user, it's usually the people who have direct contact with the environment that have this empirical data. It's also rooted in some of the spirituality and worldview that's a little distinct from scientific knowledge, but a lot of the end result can often be similar. So the trick with the chestnut is that of the people living, this knowledge base is largely gone. So there are stories here and there that are sort of gathered from ethnologies from the early 20th century, or one person knows one story about a grandmother who knew this, but this is a lost body of knowledge. And so the question is, how do you engage and how do you motivate around a tree, a species that has no living relationship? So that's been a real challenge to work through as we go in thinking that that some of these communities, of course, would want restoration or revitalization around this chestnut, but they don't. I mean, it's a stranger to them. So it's hard to even think about investing time and energy in that. And to that end, spiritual responsibility and kin-centric relationships. So this is a very relational worldview as best I can represent it. And this idea of spiritual responsibility is largely rooted in what's known as the original instructions. And that's sort of the big traditions that are handed down through time and space. And a lot of these communities, they're thousands of years old. And the big sort of monkey wrench in all of this is that most of these worldviews are rooted on this idea of a non-intervention. So accepting gifts as they are. It means living within the cycles on the earth, of the earth as they are. So that's had some real implications for how I understand this project, because genetic engineering is peak intervention, right? So it's not just that we're talking about something that we don't really like, it is just sort of the far end of something that goes counter to what a lot of people in these communities believe. But this is a more recent addition to my body of data, and it's most perplexing. That also includes restoration at all. So the idea of restoration, the idea of trying to bring back, the idea of trying to fight an invasive species sound really foreign and a big waste of time to the folks that I've spoken with. So this idea that we want to enroll Indigenous communities in restoration sounds really great, and I was all for it and thought maybe this would be a really great way to show some really cool things, and it turns out, we don't really care. So this is not negative results, but it's kind of halfway negative results, right? Like it's sort of really challenging about how to talk about it, because that absence of interest is definitely data, right? Like we assume that they're going to want to participate. And most of them don't, I think. We'll see. I have another chapter on participation that's going to be framed a little differently. So this is a little bit of a different framing. But it is important to know that I was only able to sample like a certain number of people, right? This is not going to reflect everyone. I did talk to the sort of gatekeepers and the environmental leaders. And so I know that who I have talked to is going to represent sort of leadership and what may go into the Grand Council sorts of decisions. But here and there on the edges, there are people saying like, well, yeah, it'd be really cool to have a chestnut come back. I think we should. If we have the science, this is the one thing we should do that's good. It's not super common, but it's definitely worth mentioning that it's just not a monolith. There's no part of this that's monolithic. Even in the same person, like, well, no, we can't use this as medicine. But at the same time, even hybrids are off limits. So there's just a lot of nuance here that I think, assuming too much going in, you get the answers you look for, unless you keep asking, and then you start to see that data comes out differently than you expect. So this is still in progress a little bit in terms of its analysis, but the big picture for reciprocal restoration is that these are ideas that really need to be considered if we're talking about including Indigenous communities in a lot of these efforts. And that includes GM foods, that includes a lot of other, some of these conservation efforts coming down the pike. Excuse me, and that feeds into this next chapter, which is looking at participation in the governance of chestnut restoration. So that was more theoretical, like how are we thinking about this idea in terms of worldview? And I'm interested in this chapter and how the rubber meets the road. So again, I started this from the perspective of environmental justice, so thinking about distribution of environmental bads unequitably as the sort of basis for environmental justice. And while we would not all in this room say that transgenic material is an environmental bad, it's worth considering that it might be to some people. And so sort of recognizing what that might mean in terms of the Haudenosaunee communities, and then how they might participate in decisions about these issues. And I also dovetail that with inclusive risk governance, because biotech, if nothing else, is often framed in terms of risk. Risk can be unpacked 1,000 ways, but I think just the idea of what kind of risk does biotech pose? So my broad question is what must be recognized in the environmental justice sense when considering Haudenosaunee participation in the governance of the American chestnut restoration. I think I just added a word. So I'm looking at it from two perspectives. One, participation in the governance. So that's just the decisions made around the chestnut and its potential restoration. A starting point is the two-row wampum, which is a 1613 treaty with then the Dutch, later on the English, and then later on the Americans. So essentially this is this idea that there's two governments, they're both in the same stream, they're not going to interact, they're not going to impact each other, they're just going to coexist relatively peacefully, right? The river of life. This is a little more meaningful in 1613 when the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a really fierce and feared group of people. So they were being diplomatic. They were being humanitarian, saying like, we're going to leave the English or the Dutch or whoever at the time alone and let us do our thing. Over time, those tables have turned, and the honoring of this treaty has been mixed at best, I guess is the best way to put it. But in general, the two-row wampum sort of says that we have separate governance processes, which means that these ideals we have about enrolling in this multicultural decision-making process gets a little messy, because they're like, we're not really interested in making too many decisions that are going to impact you as long as you do the same for us. So there's this guiding principle of sort of separateness that really sort of disrupts this idea I had about participatory governance or inclusive risk governance. The other dimension to consider is this idea of consultation versus free, prior, and informed consent. So consultation is the word in the law. It really fits into a lot of environmental and natural resource policies. It also fits into the APHIS frameworks in terms of the bio-coordinated framework. So basically they are required by law to consult with tribes. What that can mean is a letter is sent to them telling them that this process is happening. And that's really interesting when you're talking about some of these really complex issues. And the language in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples asks for free, prior, and informed consent. So what does that mean? And that's what we're still working through. That's some of the language that I'm struggling with here at the tail end of writing, like what might that look like in real life? But it's definitely not just a box to tick. It's definitely broader, it definitely takes more time. And it has a lot of interesting implications for the ideas of responsible research and innovation that I'm gonna touch on just a tiny bit because it's complicated. And the other ideas that have come up, if we're not talking about governance in a government sense of the word, there's other stakeholders, other groups that we could cooperate with to sort of work through some of these ideas together. And that's through university collaboration. The only challenge there, not the only challenge, one of the big challenges there is a lot of this mistrust and sort of history of violence also comes from the universities. So working through, and Adam did a good job of explaining some of that with the rice example of like how they had to work through some of those tensions. So this idea of university collaboration has popped up in the data as like maybe we want to do this as part of our having a say in how this unfolds. And I think it's definitely something I would like to consider more, but don't have a huge amount of time to talk through here. But looking at how these all fit together, well, if the government and decision-making processes are going to be separate, but we still want to have free, prior, and informed consent about some of these major decisions that are going to affect us. And a lot of these decisions are starting, or at least tools being used through university systems and university research programs, how those can sort of fit together, and how that the university collaborations can be a site and a starting point to sort of improve upon sort of lackluster consultation or lackluster communication. The other piece is the participation in the restoration itself. This is where I got really surprised a couple of months ago and go ahead to do some major rewrites. Genetically engineered plants, perhaps not surprisingly, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of, we don't think we want to use genetically engineered plants because it's kind of counter to our worldview, so it makes it tricky to try to think about using transgenic plants, and even if it's for restoration, it makes a lot of sense to sort of think through why that. You can probably make safe assumptions about why this might be true in a lot of indigenous communities, and broadly, these big stories around it not being consistent with our worldview hold for this. I say broadly, there are exceptions, but from a narrative perspective, that's pretty consistent. What does disrupt this a little bit is this non-intervention as original instructions, like I spoke to a minute ago, is that also means not participating in restoration more generally. There are clear examples of indigenous communities participating in restoration, so that's something that I'm kind of grappling with about how those things coexist, and how that sort of tension might actually be a space to investigate. Because if I've got people saying that non-intervention is their basis for their worldview, but we see in the data, or see in the literature, there are indigenous groups participating in restoration efforts, I want to see more about that. I want to understand that better. But non-intervention, there's a really good quote from one of my interviews, like, we're not stewards of the earth. That's just not our job. And he's distinguishing himself from some of the stuff he's seen with the restoration folks who think they're sort of managers and can usher in and use their skills to sort of improve upon the earth. Well, that's not how they see it. They don't see themselves as stewards. Their job is to sort of live within the cycles as they are. And I'm still grappling with how that might make sense on the ground. And in any circumstance that restoration is involved, they speak about restoring relationship, to be able to go back in and restore their ability to live within the cycles of the earth as they are now. So that sounds interesting on like a 10,000 foot level, and I'm really interested in unpacking that a little bit more, and hopefully as my career moves forward I'll be able to do that a little bit. So the implications for all of this, there's a couple of big ones. To me, this is the most obvious. So this idea of biotechnology and conservation and restoration, as a lot of you in this room work directly on, is exploding, right? So it's complicated, it's a little bit contentious, but it's in the literature, it's happening, it's coming. So if this is an increasing possibility, while we also have Indigenous management of biodiversity and restored landscapes, these spheres are going to bump up against each other time and again. And so what kind of conversations can happen in the middle that don't necessarily assume all of these things we think we know? I think there's space for some real interesting work there in the future. So some pretty simple worldviews matter. And more do I try to unpack the worldview that comes in the statements that I hear, and I think that applies broadly to some of the factionalization happening right now, but I think this is just something to really keep in the back of my mind. Is that right? Can I make sense of the world? And especially as researchers working with groups that we think we want to do some social good, taking a long view, looking at these long, complex histories, and doing our best not to reproduce those exclusions, inequalities, and erasures. And that's something that I think we'll all continue to work on. There's our neat, tidy package. And I think that's it.
Is it about a little more than 10 minutes for questions?
Yeah, it was a lot. Jen.
So I'm also interested in this worldview of non-interventionist kind of thing that you're talking about in relation to the kids and probably adults too that grew up in like the more American culture where they're clearly going to be influenced by that, which does take an interventionist worldview. And is there a conflict, or how do they merge the two? I know you're kind of talking about your future work, maybe.
That's a really good question, and I actually do have a specific section on that in one of my chapters, because there is a generational tension. So we have folks raised in the longhouse, which is raised traditionally, but I mean, by virtue of time, that starts to change, and sort of the new generation grew up eating GM foods, grew up living in a very different world. And so people that I talk to speak specifically to that tension. Like, well, I know what the elders would say, but I don't know what the new leaders would say. And so as what I argue for, and ultimately one of my chapters, is they need to have some space to have this conversation. And so a lot of that is very pressing, like not just about GM, not just about like restoration, but all sorts of things. Like how are they evolving as a people in that space? Yes, that generational tension is very real.
I was interested in the fact that with a lot of with some of your interviews anyways, they were willing to have a conversation with you, but then didn't want it on the record. I'm wondering, looking back on that now, at the end of your research, having sitting with it as you have for so long, what you think was going on there, and if there's a way that you could have presented yourself for your research. If you would have presented it now differently at the end, knowing what you know, that maybe would have opened up a deeper level of trust, or if you thought how you understand that tension now.
Some of that I think is specific to the time I was able to spend. So one of my limitations was I was only able to travel a certain number of times, and I had, there's a reason ethnography really requires sustained like 2 years, because you definitely get a different perspective. And so some of the people I spoke with specifically made it clear that this could be a precursor to an interview, and that just never, for different reasons, didn't unfold. That's definitely true in some spaces, and I don't think I could present the research differently, but I think if I were able to stay longer or go back more times, that may be true. I don't think that's true of everyone. I think some of the folks we talked to were raised pretty traditionally, and I just don't think that's true of everyone. And that, I could be wrong, but I don't think so. I think that there's always going to be this sort of guarded distrust of university researchers, and
but they were willing to share it with you, though, right?
But there's my they specifically said, this is for you as a person, not for the rest of the world. So the fact that they shared it with me is great, and I felt really honored by that. But I think his point was, I don't have the ability to reshape the whole world to receive that information. I can receive it and sort of grow from it, but I can't make the rest of the world do that, and I don't think there was anything I could ever have said or done to change his perspective about that, if that makes sense. Because there was a different stage, I guess. Yeah.
So I think you sort of ended a lot in the context of the two-road treaty. But when you were giving examples of things that individuals had said to you, a lot of them sounded pretty informal. And I guess the comment I'm really thinking of, people have said, yeah, that sounds interesting. You know, maybe that restoration idea is kind of neat. So how much was the feedback or that you received or that you're able to talk about sort of directly in the context of like traditional or indigenous law, and how much of it was in sort of a more individualistic sense?
I'm not sure I follow the question.
Well, so you talked a lot about things in the context of non-interference, and particularly in the context of this one treaty which dictates non-interference. And I'm wondering if you are presenting that as just something that you recently thought encapsulated all of this, or if people were specifically bringing it up when they were talking to you.
So there was the treaty, and then there's also the original instructions, and both of those get evoked explicitly. That's a really good question. Like I didn't sort of look back and see that as a conclusion, but what I did do, and that's sort of the beauty of kind of emergent coding, is once I saw that come up specifically, I started to make a little bit, like infer back a little bit as well, but they were really explicit very regularly about that, both original instructions as non-intervention and the two-row wampum as non-intervention. That's a really good question. Yeah, that's still, it's on the tip of their tongue. I'll just, yeah, Megan?
So while the chestnut and this idea might be, you know, new with the technology, is there any examples of something that could be arriving now or, you know, encroaching in on like the sovereign kind of territory as like an example or something? Or like what else, you know, there's not like a hard and fast boundary, right? Like what things are going on between currently and like any adaptive management?
Do you mean for restoration, or?
Yeah, like anything else going on that you can kind of use as an example, or?
So there's two things that come to mind, and tell me if this does or does not answer your question, and especially for those of y'all who are in Mexico, the idea of how corn is, like, the role of corn there is also very important. And so this idea of contaminated corn is really important there as well. But it's not just GM corn, it's some of the sort of just, a lot of corn grown around that means GM, but a lot, like it's not necessarily why. It's that it's contaminating their sort of special, their special types of corn. So that is an example of sort of they're feeling more protective, and that's actually the basis for some of this sort of feeling protective against chestnut. Sort of on the other end of the extremes, they do work with watershed restoration groups. So it's not a species, it's a landscape issue, and it's also their traditional land. It's also very sacred. The particular landscapes that I'm thinking of are very sacred and very historic. So there is an example of participation in governance of restoration, but the motivations are different. It's sort of going back to restoring their ability to live with their worldviews, not so much restoring a particular way that maybe ecologists might think of it. But I'm not sure if that's what you were asking.
Yes.
Cool. I saw Mike and then I'll come here.
So the watershed thing is getting a little bit of what I want to get at. So it seems like humans did something, it sort of screwed up the watershed was important to them, so they're trying to get back to that, right? Here you have a human introduction of this fungus from, I guess, Japan or something like that, right? Does it matter that it was human, the blight was human introduced versus naturally or non-human introduced, you know what I mean? Or is that like totally tangential to that?
It matters a little. One of the big differences there as well is this watershed restoration does hinder their ability to engage with the world the way they believe they should, because it goes through their lands. They can't eat the fish. They can't sort of relate and live in the way that they have been told to live. This idea of the chestnut doesn't affect their way of life. Like this idea of the chestnut coming in or disappearing has not affected their way of life now. I'll rephrase. For the people alive now, the chestnut coming would make no difference. So they don't see it as sustaining the life that they want to live. So the idea of the ragamuffin earth, which is something Jessica reintroduced me to, is like we sort of make peace with what we have and sort of build resilient ecosystems as they are, is really sounds incredibly indigenous. And so that's really more the question going on. So the fact that it's human introduced, they sort of say, well, yeah, we shouldn't have done it. But they are all, like, in every single one of my interviews, well, these are just the consequences we have to pay for screwing up. That's not what they say about the watershed. And I don't fully, that's a space that I'd like to explore more, because I think it's interesting. And I think there's a difference, but I'm not fully ready to talk about it yet, just because I'm still making sense of what I'm learning. Yeah.
I've got a question from the live stream.
Okay.
Royden Saul wants to know, do you think that the indigenous perspective would be different, similar to your question, if the GE were focused on the invasive fungus versus the native tree?
I hope I can speak to this correctly, because one of the explicit things that I've found to be fascinating about this is the idea of invasive species as a construct, and that we as humans don't necessarily fully understand how all of these things fit together. So a lot of the folks I talk to don't even have interest in fighting invasive species. So I mean, the genetic engineering actually does target the fungus, which is why I'm pausing a little bit over the question. But I think the big take-home picture is, from my understanding, from whom I've spoken with, invasive species are not a universal construct.
And he just texted me and said Mike's question covered it.
Oh, then I'll just stop that. Okay. Yeah, I'll start here.
So this is somewhat a little bit related to the blight being human introduced, but I thought it was interesting the world view of GMOs not being created by humans, and so we have no ceremonies for it, we have no songs for it. Are you going to explore it all in your dissertation, and maybe also in your conversations with them, the comparison between artificial selection, which is also very human influence, versus GMOs, and how that fits in, like the difference in reaction to it and how they feel about it?
There's a little bit of rumbling on the side of some of my interview data, like, well, we do breed plants. Like, there is some conversation around, like, the gradient idea of, like, human intervention and humans as plant breeders. There's a couple things to that. One, and this I believe is consistent with some of the things I've read about corn, is the hybrid chestnut, which is another way that they're looking to restore. According to one woman I spoke with about her interpretation of how it might work as a medicinal plant, the hybrid is even less likely to work for her than the GM chestnut. So that's not necessarily illustrative of the whole system, but it's interesting information there, right? So it's kind of speaking to what you're saying. The other thing that's really interesting is that one of my participants said, we're more interested in plants that need human help. So that corn and some of these cultivars, we're more interested in taking care of that. And a lot of the folks he's talked to said, the chestnut never needed us, it just lived in the forest. So there is agroforestry and there is a sort of interconnection, but there are different qualitative categories that sort of speak to your question, I think it's been in my radar.
So you said they don't have songs about GMOs. Did they have songs about chestnuts?
That's a really good question, and they do and did, and they're really hard to find. So we're having to go back into old ethnologies, a lot of which were translated into English from sort of anthropological phase of research. So figuring out like how accurate these are and how much they represent how they live, yeah, but there are stories there, and that is J.M.B. Hewitt is early 20th century ethnologist, whatever the word is, he did it, yes, they're out there.
One more?
Oh, sorry, I haven't heard from you yet.
I'm probably going to be interested. So, it has to do with working with indigenous communities. I'm not sure, and I don't know what are the core values that they all may share, but from your perspective, did you find some values that you or not only values but also worldviews that you not only do not agree with, but you find them to be shocking for you? And what's the place of the researcher over there if you find so to shape the way you depict our
Right.
community on a work.
It's a really good point, and I have written about this idea of positionality as social scientists who are trained to sort of see themselves in the data so they're not projecting onto it. And that's a really important part of some of this training. Yes, there are some things that surprised me, including this idea of we're not stewards, we're not going to intervene, and the degree to which that, like how far out those implications go. So I think that's one of those things I've been sort of told over time, but then it was told in a very specific stark, restoration is kind of a crazy waste of time for us idea, in a way that just really hit me over the head, aha, like, and then sort of made other things click differently. But like letting sort of us deal with our consequences, I understand it from that perspective, but it's hard for me to internalize. That's a good question, especially as a sort of non-native trying to make sense of this and communicate well about it.
Great. Well, we're at the end of our time. Let's thank Katie. And if you happen to be interested, remember that defenses are open to the public. So we'll certainly announce when Katie is defending her dissertation if you want to come see the different presentation version.
Yeah, it's actually kind of pretty different.
Some major differences. Great. We will see you next week. And those who are in the discussion section, if you want to gather for a couple minutes to do the reading, do that now.